to plan my own journey because I want to see if I can do a better job than that GPS thing tells me. You know, sometimes those GPS devices put me somewhere I never intended to be. Not everything is exactly accurate. But if I can get on the map and I can trace that myself, I miss that. I don't know whatever happened to them. We don't use them anymore hardly. I think it's sad. But if you use a map or if you use a GPS, there's one reason why you're doing it. You don't know where you're going, and you want to be sure that you get there. Our theme this year is Climb the Mountain. And we come today to the idea of saying, understanding, we need to climb that mountain, and we need to appreciate, we need to honor, we need to think about the guide gift that we have. Our concept today is to think about being guided on our journey up the mountain. Tonight we will consider the necessity that all of us should follow the leader. But today we learn about that guide. We learn about that leader. It is important that we have a guide to get to the place that we want to go because we don't know. Think with me for a minute as we begin first to notice that you can be assured and I can be assured that God is guiding the affairs of the world. Now, it may not seem like that to you. It may not seem that God is really in charge because things are so out of control. I want you to listen to the words of Psalm 33. And I would recommend this psalm to you. It's a very powerful psalm. It begins by talking about God is the creator. And the whole concept of the psalm is the sovereignty of God. He is in charge. He created everything. And then he begins in verse 10. The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He makes the plans of the people of no effect. The counsel of the Lord stands forever. The plans of his heart to all generations. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he has chosen as his own inheritance. God says, I made everything and I run everything. God is in charge. I don't know sometimes if I remember that, because I sometimes equate God being in charge with things happening the way that I want them to happen. And if they're not happening the way that I want, and I think I know what God wants, then obviously God's not doing his job. How arrogant is that? This psalm goes on to talk about God is watching, he is looking, he sees everything. And he says, I don't care what king there is, the army is not going to save him if I don't want it to be true. He can't deliver his own soul. Therefore the psalmist closes and says, our soul waits for the Lord. God has always been in charge of the affairs of this world. In Genesis 6 through 8, God brought a flood that destroyed the entire world. That changed the affairs of the world. In Genesis 11, the people had banded together and were not following God's plan to spread out and to fill the world. And they wanted to build this great tower to their own glory. And God came down and confused all of their languages so they could not communicate. And they had to spread out and do what God said. God affected the affairs of the world. And throughout the Old Testament, we see that God raises up and brings down nations. In Jeremiah 18, Jeremiah is told by God, if any nation or kingdom that I choose to pluck up, to pull down, to destroy, changes its ways, I'll change my idea. And if any nation or kingdom that I choose to raise up and to settle, if they become evil, I'll change. God is in charge. Now the psalmist said, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. In context, notice what he's saying. He's talking about his people, Israel. Because the second part of that verse says, the people he has chosen as his inheritance. So he is saying, Israel is blessed because I chose them. But by the rest of that psalm that we considered, he's not confining that idea simply to Israel. He is talking to every nation that ever rises on this planet. And he says, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. I've heard the arguments that say Christians are separate from this world and we should not be involved in this world. It is even stated by some that they go so far as to say, because we are Christians, we should not even vote. Because we are Christians, we should not even run for a political office. Because we are Christians, we should not get involved in the affairs of this country. Let me ask a question. Do you think it is possible that God's governing of the affairs of the world and of any particular country are done through the agency of the people of that country? I think so. Didn't he raise up Esther in a foreign land? He did. Did he raise up Daniel in a foreign country? Yes. Wasn't Joseph given power in a world empire? Yes. God uses the people. It is our privilege to live here. We say it often. I know it is a privilege because there are so many people trying to get to this country. Name another country on this planet that people are in droves trying to get into. Should we not then be concerned? If God is governing the affairs of this world and our country particularly. I acknowledge that, and you do too. But is it not our responsibility to honor our government? Romans 13, yes it is. And does that include my involvement in whatever way to influence by godly living that people do better in a country? Yes. Why then not would I be involved in helping to create the better country? Through voting, through being involved in lawmaking, through doing whatever I can, saying that God is using me as He manages the affairs of this world. As we climb the mountain, while we climb, remember, God is in charge. Number two, every single person needs a guide. The famous passage of Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go when he's old. He won't depart from it. It is interesting to me that every time we use that passage, it seems like we talk about telling them about God. Certainly that's true. But I think this verse is giving a very basic fact. And the fact is, every person who comes into this world needs a guide. We need a guide for this physical world. No baby could survive without a guide in the form of a parent. Natural parent, adoptive parent, fostering parent, doesn't matter. It's still a parent guide. Every person who grows up into an adult needs a guide in the form of a teacher to help them learn anything. Is there one person in this room who has reached adulthood who would raise his or her hand and say, everything I learned on my own without the help of anybody else? Not a hand should rise. Because we can't get through this life without a guide to teach us the things that we need in this life. Not possible. And we all need a guide who will help us learn to be good citizens in a country through the guide of laws. Otherwise, chaos. So the Proverbs writer was right. He's saying, you need to train up a child for this world. They need good habits, training ability to learn a job, to understand how to live in this country, to be the people in this world that they need to be. Needs a guide. But they certainly need a guide for the spiritual world. Proverbs writer said again in chapter 16 and verse 9, that the heart of man makes his plans, but God directs his steps. I think what he's saying is this: the heart of man left to itself will not do what God would have that heart do. The heart of man wants to go one way, but controlling that heart and letting God guide the steps is the sign of maturity. Because he would also say, the Proverbs writer in chapter 20 and verse 24, God makes plans for his steps. How can a man understand his way? How can we know where to go and what to do? We need a guide. We need a guide for this world, and we need a guide for the world that is to come. As we're climbing the mountain, we have been given the gift of a guide. Third, we come to the guide. We come to the one who is guiding us. Will you turn to the text of Luke chapter 1? If you go back a few verses to verse 67, you'll find that this is a prophecy from the mouth of Zacharias, the father of John the Baptizer. And God is speaking to John through his father, and he's telling him what his future will be. And I want you to notice, at the time he's telling him, at the time his father is blessing him, he is less than 6 months old. Now you think about that a minute. Do you know mothers and fathers who have talked to their children while they were still in the womb? I do. God had Zacharias talk to his son before he could even ascertain what was being said. God said through Zacharias to his son, verse 76, "You, child, will be called the prophet of the highest." You're going to lead the way. It's your job. You're going to prepare the way for the one who's coming, his cousin Jesus. And he is. And he did. And John preached. And John let the people know, look who's coming. Why did he do that? Because God said, you need a guide. You can't do it on your own. You need a guide because you have a problem. You see, man needs this guide. Romans 3, starting in verse 9 through 18, begins with these words, "There is none who does righteous, no, not one." He's not saying that no single person has ever done anything righteous. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, no one left on his own will be righteous enough for me. We need a guide. We need a guide because that text says we are hopeless. We don't have it within us to save ourselves. It cannot happen. We need a guide because we're hopeless. Number two, we need a guide because we're helpless. In Acts chapter 8, God sent Philip to chase down a chariot that was riding in the wilderness. God knew there was a man there that needed his attention because he was a seeking heart. The text tells us that this man, the eunuch, had been in Jerusalem worshiping the God that he believed in. He was a Jewish man, a converted Jewish man. And as he's going home, Philip tracked him down. And when he got to the chariot, the text says he heard him reading from the book of Isaiah. And Philip said, Do you understand what you're reading? And the eunuch responded, how can I, unless someone help me? That's us. God knows we need a guide. Because unless He helps us, we don't have a chance. So why do we need Him? What are we going to get from Him? 3 things this text says that we get. Number 1, we need God's guidance. We need the guidance of Jesus, who was coming after John the Baptizer, so that we would know about salvation. To give the knowledge of salvation to His people by the remission of their sins. How is this going to happen? Through the mercy of God, verse 78. And through the visitation of God, verse 78. All of mankind as a whole needs the guidance of Jesus, because without it, they would never know salvation. They would never have sins remitted. Number 2, without the guidance of Jesus, we would not know true light. The world is saying through its own lights that flash beautifully, look at this. Isn't this great? But that's not true light. Verse 79, God says those people are still in darkness. They're still sitting under the shadow of death. The guide Jesus came to bring true light. I've heard about pure light. I don't understand that side of this world, but I get it. And God says you need the guide. Number 3, verse 39 or 79. You would not know about peace without the guide, Jesus. He said, I come to give you my peace, not like the world gives, but like I give. And we would not know peace without our guide to tell us about it. Today, you are climbing. We're all climbing. We're climbing somewhere, going someplace, and it's a matter of deciding, am I going to climb with the proper guide or not? I can't make it on my own. You can't make it on your own because we don't know where to go. But Jesus says, I'll guide you. And I'll show you about salvation. And I'll show you about light. And I'll teach you about peace. And while we climb the mountain, let us be grateful for the guide gift that God has given us. If you're ready to accept the offer of Jesus to guide you up the mountain climb, you can be like others recently have. You can submit to Jesus as the guide, believing in Him, repenting of sins, confessing His name, and being immersed into Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of sins. It's what Zechariah said John the Baptizer was leading people to understand about Jesus. And if you've left the guide and followed your own way, and you're ready to come and reestablish the proper journey with the proper guide, we're here for you while we stand and sing together.